Cliff, over to you. I'm a little bit surprised you have notes. I thought we agreed that you were going to use interpretive dance to deliver your presentation, but
you really don't want that. That would be a big mistake. Well, thank you for welcoming me into this land and its peoples. I'm really honoured. Impact investment. So, what does that mean for us? It means to us that it's repayable finance, where both the investor and the enterprise are intentional about creating a social or environmental benefit and measure the result and act on it. That's what it means to us. I'm going to talk a bit about the pain point, about the solutions, about what's going right, what's challenging, and the big question, is it right for you as social enterprises? So the pain point. Here's a saying from back in 2002. If we do not tackle social issues very differently, a curtain of fire will come to separate the rich from the poor. That was a statement made by Ronnie Cohen, who was our founder, 15 years ago. It was prescient. Trump, Brexit, Alternative for Deutschland, over and over. One country after another that used to be liberal, democratic and cohesive, polarizing into opposites with great levels of conflict. Unlike many countries, we've had in the UK major challenges on social welfare and social cohesion. Things like ageing society, things like poverty, communities that have been left behind, and that left behind is now multi-generational. The lowest 25% income level in the UK, the population haven't had a real terms pay increase for 35 years. That really means it's your grandfather or grandmother who last had a pay rise. It is not surprising that there is anger and revolt. And of course, the 2008 crash, we had austerity, public service cuts, and so on. And governments and non-profits have struggled to keep up with those issues. Non-profits and social enterprises in particular have been undercapitalized, so they haven't been able to reform, change for changed circumstances, to do as much as they want. So can social investment help with those challenges? That's the question. And of course, those problems have been matched at the same time by a huge wave of interest in social purpose across the population, particularly millennial age, but really across the population. In the UK, a recent survey that we were involved with, between 30 and 40% of the population wanted their savings and pensions, contributions and so on, to go for social impact investment, not normal commercial. That's way beyond where it was over 5 years ago. Some solutions. So in the UK, we've been lucky to have a very long history of very broad and deep social sector. And we've also got a very vibrant startup scene, 600,000 new companies every year, and a quarter of them intend a social or environmental mission. That's staggering. We've been lucky to have long-term cross-governmental, cross-party government support for social enterprise and social investment right across the spectrum, every part of it. And part of that was the launch of us as a dual purpose organisation, both the world's first wholesale social investor and also a market champion. So we were created to both use finance, investment, and any other tool we could to develop a vibrant and useful impact investment, social investment market in the UK. Has that worked? Well, this is our latest stats. We've just reached $1 billion in UK terms. That's about 1.3 billion US dollars. I can't translate that offhand into New Zealand dollars, I'm afraid. 600 million drawn down, 10 times as much risk capital as was available to the social sector just 5 years ago. A 20% annual growth rate, now escalating up to 30%. We've got stronger intermediaries, we've got more skilled staff, we've got more choice, growing understanding, 3,600 social enterprises invested, and it's highly diverse. Everything from accelerators and seed funds, through venture funds, loans funds, social banks, crowdfunding, community share issues, local and regional funds, charity bond issues, social impact bonds, angel networks. And somebody's telling me that there's something new. That's probably coming from Mars as I'm going to take that away from the technology and hopefully not forget it afterwards. So there are lots of options for people. The problem now is navigation. How do you find your way to the thing that's most relevant to you? And we've got a new collaborative website on that, goodfinance.org.uk. So what's gone right, what's gone wrong? Plenty of fabulous stories of success. Some of the ones that I like, Unforgettable, which is the online marketplace for anything that you need if somebody in your family has dementia. Golden Lane, raising bonds issues to be able to provide more homes for people with learning disabilities. Just so many. But there are still some very big challenges in the UK. Some we found answers to, some are really tricky. Top challenge is affordability. So most social organisations are on tiny, tiny margins, and even a modest repayment rate is overwhelming for them. So we collaborated with the government and some other agencies to create a thing called Access, which has blended grant and social investment, and also reduces transaction costs and helps with investment readiness. We hoped that one of the things we'd be able to do is provide investment to allow social organisations to provide services to government agencies. And that's been a pretty total disappointment. And we haven't found any solutions. We have tried and tried and tried, and it's just not working. Impact management has been seen as universally important and universally burdensome, with loads of measures, all confused, and very few tools to be able to bring it together. Now we've got the Impact Management Programme. If you haven't seen about it yet, it's really worth looking at. It's probably going to be the global standard, right the way from beneficiaries, social organisations, all the way up to wholesale investors like ourselves, and how you put a portfolio together. And then the big deal, the new kid on the block, which is both exciting and deeply scary, is that suddenly, in the last year, big institutional commercial investment funds are creating impact funds. Been touched on already. Is this going to overwhelm the sort of social market in impact investment? Quite possibly. Is that a good thing because they bring a lot more capital? Well, that's a good thing. Is it going to be sort of the equivalent of greenwashing, whitewashing? We don't know, and there's a lot of work to do on this. But I just wanted to end up with, because I'm talking about our challenges, what about your challenges as social enterprises? And you gave us a challenge, because basically you voted that it wasn't working. So here's my effort on why you might take social investment, impact investment, and why you might not. So, you are going to seek impact investment if you believe that the investment will boost your social mission, so you can help the people, more of the people that you're trying to help, and that you'll be able to pay back the investment. So you might use an investment to buy an asset like a building, to bridge a timing gap because you're going to do some work and you only get paid at the end, for expansion, for growth. And you've worked out that this new activity will generate enough surplus to pay back the investment. Okay. So, why might you not go for impact investment? Because you're not able to pay. You're not going to get a surplus that will repay. You can find cheaper ways of raising the money. Maybe you've got a donor base. Great. You're not going to have to repay that. It's donation. And here's the most important thing, because you've got too much social risk. So maybe you're already supporting very vulnerable beneficiaries, and you take on this new work and new investment, it goes wrong, your organisation goes into bankruptcy, into administration, and those vulnerable beneficiaries suddenly lose their service. Social risk is real, we've experienced it in the UK, and it's a very important consideration. Why is it that most people feel like investment isn't working for them? The chances are that there are two reasons for that. One is that the investment isn't right. The other is that actually it's not right for you. And there's no shame whatsoever in impact investment not being right for you. The great majority of companies, commercial or social, never touch external investment. They grow organically, they make a surplus, they reinvest their own surplus. That's great. You only go to take money from somebody else, which you'll have to repay with some sort of interest, if you can't do that. And as I say, I think it's in the UK, it's something like only 3% of companies seek external investment in any given year. So the chances are it's not right for you, and that's the right decision for you. That's a piece that we've been putting out into the UK, and we've seen really dramatic changes in the sense of people feeling quite comfortable, it's not for us, and others feeling, I understand why it is for us, and we're going to approach. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's a little bit useful in dealing with that terrible B that we got on our rating. Thank you.
Thanks, Cliff. And so as I said earlier, please use the app if you've got questions. I think there's no hiding from that. I'd really like to explore what's in that. Right, so what's in the 1, 2, and 3? Ask the hard questions, and I think it's an opportunity for you to hear from panel members about their opinion on the questions that you have. But also, if we're going to make it work better for both investors and enterprises, I think that's a conversation that we've got to bottom out and we've got to keep progressing on. And that's only going to happen if we're honest, authentic, and willing to step into the difficult topics. So I'd encourage you, please pop your questions through the app, but I might kick off with a couple. When I listen to all of you speak, there's different kind of ways that you're each talking about social impact investing. You're talking about different groups, you're looking at it from a foundation's perspective or a philanthropist's perspective, and institutions and corporates and wholesalers and all of these different perspectives. It seems to mean different things to different people. That's a little confusing. Why is that? And what is that because it's just so diverse, or is it that there's different perspectives that we're coming at it from? Why are there so many different perspectives here? Anyone can answer that.
I thought it was hanging together really well. Yeah.
Quite simply, it's impact investing is when you have the intention, as you mentioned, to have social and financial returns. For the sake of simplicity, that's all it is. If you're a foundation, you can do that through your grant, leveraging further investment. If you're working with investors, you can still work with them to make sure that both don't have to be mutually exclusive. And it's the same for all of us. So I think the essence of the definition, which Cliff said, is really what we all hinge on.
But then, of course, there are lots of different circumstances.
Yeah.
So, the majority of people in this room, I think, are probably working in social enterprises of some kind. They're incredibly diverse, large, small, different sectors, different geographies, and so on, as they should be to tackle social problems. Social investment is probably a lot less diverse than social enterprises, but it is still diverse, and it's good that it's diverse because a small community organisation is not going to approach a big institutional investor. Equally, a big institutional investor is not going to even look at a small community organisation. The differences of scale are just too big. So you need different types of investors, different circumstances. And I'd also say that actually that each country is going to have a different sort of universe of social enterprises and social investment because the problems that you face are different, the solutions that you've got are different, things are happening here in New Zealand that couldn't happen in the UK and vice versa. So I think it's appropriate that there is that diversity. Then you need the navigation. You need good navigation so that you can find your way to the place that's right for you.
And I think from a foundation point of view, we really try and understand where we're needed. What is the point? Is it a business plan? Is it exploring the idea? Is it initial capacity building to get a social enterprise going? Or is it at a later point when they want to scale up? And we fund it at all these different times to different amounts, depending on where we're actually needed. So it's really case by case that we look at it, which is probably why it is diverse.
Paddy, you touched on this in your presentation, but so I might come back to you on this. But Cliff, I wanted to cover. There's a few questions here around return, okay, and the return expectations of investors. I think one of the challenges for many of the enterprises, and you also touched on it, is their capacity to produce that return for investors and the expectations that investors might have. Can you talk a little bit about investor expectations in investing in social enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, again, investor intentions are going to be very different. Some are looking for commercial level returns. Some, like us, are accepting a positive return, but not at market rates. There are others that will go at just getting their capital back, or even being prepared to lose it. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about this. Can I just take the example of a 5-year loan, okay, that you're going to repay? Let's say I'm offering it at 8% and you're offering it at 6%. What is the difference between? The difference is not between 8 and 6. The difference is between 28 and 26, because you've got to pay the capital back. So that's 20% a year paying the capital back. Many people look at the headline interest rate and are thinking that's too high. Actually, it's the repayment of capital that is the big deal. So I think there are many poorly communicated issues about this, and the fundamental of this is you've got to pay the money back. The interest rate, there's some exceptional circumstances, very high risk circumstances. In the main, the difference between different investors is going to be 1 or 2%, which is nothing compared to the cost of repaying the capital itself.
I guess I'll touch base on the first question as well as this one. So we do see a lot of social enterprises or nonprofits that are want to reach out to us and say, who should we talk to, or who should we to fund our project or organization. And I think it goes back to the point that funders are also so diverse and have such a different risk appetite that my advice is always to those organizations that are seeking resources to also do their research on understanding exactly to what Cliff was saying, what is the purpose, and also understand what type of what growth stage are you in, right? Because if you are early stage and you go to an Omidyar or a large impact investment fund, you're pretty much wasting your time, because you're not, you're too early, you're too small for them. So, so they're very diverse, and I think that the returns can vary so much from just pay me the principal, that's all I want, and I really look at the social impact more than anything, to the extreme where it's double-digit returns, and maybe social is good, but I'll just the whitewashing or greenwashing of it. So.
Paddy, you touched on the role of different types of investors there, and I don't know if Ralph's in the room, but he was talking at a session this morning about philanthropy playing a higher risk role in the world. Catherine, as from a foundation's perspective, I mean, what role do you think foundations play in this impact investing space? Mm-hmm. Or should they be playing?
We can play different roles depending on the project or the enterprise. Certainly we can help de-risk things by funding very early and making sure there's a lot of excellent work done on business planning and so on at the start. We can be involved in layered investment, so we may take a slightly lower return than the commercial investors, so we can offset that. I would say though, from our foundation point of view, if there's no return at all, it may as well be a grant, because to be an investment and part of our asset allocation, there really needs to be a return.
And there's a question here from Katie around, to you, Catherine, around do you have any advice for when an enterprise would apply for a grant versus an investment? Like any guidance, and I guess for anyone on the panel, guidance that you would give to enterprises how to figure out whether they should be going for a grant or an investment?
I think what Cliff said, really, in terms of their capacity to deal with a loan, for example. So if you're very early stage, you might be better to get a capacity building grant that you don't, we don't expect that to come back. That's an investment, a charitable investment, basically. Whereas later on, you might be well able to manage a loan and then increase the investment that way.
For us, for AVPN, we're trying to, in that continuum of capital that I talked about, we're trying to really kind of help the organizations that have been supported by, for example, members that are foundations, but now actually, they have grown and maybe they're at a later stage where they can accept actually some loans now and then connect them to members that are looking at that type of risk appetite and then kind of further along. So we do have now a few of really good case studies of organizations, of social enterprises that we've seen that have grown from actually just, being supported by foundations to now more impact investors. So,
an example there as well. So recently we worked with Bank of America Foundation. So Bank of America is the world's largest issuer of green bonds. So Bank of America Foundation, when they come to us to work with social enterprises, the first thing we said is, why don't we focus on enterprises that can someday be in your green bonds? They may not be ready for your green bonds today, but we can get them there. The big issue in this space is demand and supply are not often aligned. There may be supply of capital, but there may not be the ability to absorb and repay that kind of capital. So what we use the grant from Bank of America Foundation for is to get these enterprises investment ready, strengthen their business model, help them measure their impact, help them strengthen their financials, such that they reach a point in which they can attract investment capital and slowly reach the stage in the future in which Bank of America can potentially put them in their bonds. And this is very strategic because you're using philanthropy in a very strategic way, and at the same time you're using it in a very catalytic way to solve a real issue. So I think that's something people should keep in mind.
And is that where this word catalytic comes in, Natasha? Like we hear this word catalytic a lot. What are we talking about there, and why is that important in this space?
I think it's important because a grant is not a grant, and an investment is not just a pure investment. It's really what you can do with it. So, for instance, for us, why the Rockefeller grant was important for the Women's Livelihood Bond is because a, say, $500,000 grant unlocked $8 million of investment capital. It's that huge leverage factor that this grant capital had, that it catalyzed all these different banks and law firms and everyone to come and participate with us, so that we're not just impacting, say, 50,000 women, the bond is impacting 385,000 women. So that's catalytic use of grant funding.
I think there is a difference between, if you like, catalytic and concessionary. Catalytic, you're putting money in that you will lose. It's a grant, or you're not going to get your money back, but it's going to lever in other activity, and you will break an area of market failure. So in the future, it will be fully investable. Concessionary, this is going to be a loss maker, probably forever. So you need just subsidy. And most commonly, that would be things like, in developed countries, it would be called community development finance. In developing countries, it would be called microfinance. Hardly anybody ever makes a return on those activities.
For that reason, we now have program-related investment in Australia. We haven't done many, but that's for that type of area, which is a new thing. I don't know about New Zealand.
There's a question here around scale. I did read it earlier. I think it was... I might have lost who it was, but I got the gist of the question, whoever asked it. And Cliff, you talked about the impact management project. I know that they are dealing with this question. There's this great... Scale is probably one of the three most overused words in our whole space. But because often there's investors are coming at this with this kind of where's the scale and this, where's the scale? And at times, many of the enterprises I get the opportunity to speak with are often saying, well, hang on, there's scale, but what about depth, right? Some of the work that we're doing with the people that we work with, it's we're never going to be a global tech company, but we have really deep impact with the people that we work with. How should investors be thinking about this? How should enterprises be thinking about this scale versus depth?
I think it goes back to the pick the right investor. Yeah. There are investors, just as there are in the commercial world, that are very specialist and do niche investments, and that's true in the social sector. At the same time, if you're trying to sort out, for example, social housing, you need a lot of capital for social housing. You're probably going to get that from a big institutional investor. So again, it's finding your way to the right place and making sure that in your country you've got access to that diversity plus navigation to be able to find the right place.
I think, just again to give a tangible example, this is where innovative finance needs to step in. So for instance, with the Women's Livelihood Bond, what we did is you have these social enterprises that are very deep in their work, and you have these investors that want scale. They want an $8 million bond, otherwise it's not worth them looking at. So what we did is we grouped together a group of these organizations from 3 different countries. And once you aggregate these entities that are very deep in their work, you can create a single portfolio that's at a scale that investors are willing to look at. So the Women's Livelihood Bond is actually helping 3 different organizations in 3 different countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Philippines. So solving the scale issue while keeping the depth of impact. So I think innovative finance needs to be focused on more if we're going to keep both in tandem.
And I think the other side of that is actually aggregating the investors.
Yes.
So as a foundation, we've gone into 2 equity impact investments, but alongside a couple of other foundations. And so we actually share knowledge. We have a philanthropic investor nominee, as it were, and she works with the business and gives us information back about how the enterprise is going. So that also breeds confidence in the early stages of an impact investment.
Natasha, there's a question I wanted to ask you about. You talked about institutional and corporate players in this space, and I think there's a healthy degree of scepticism at times around the role that they can play. But can you talk a little bit about where you see them fitting in here? And also, I'd also add to that, there's a question here from Monique around how, if enterprises are engaging that community, how they engage them for maybe not just money, but what else the corporates could bring to the table around expertise or networks and those sorts of things.
So to the second question, actually, with the same Bank of America example, what we told Bank of America is when you give us the grant to get these companies investment ready, these climate resilience focused companies, don't just give us a vanilla grant. Also, why don't you send some of your employees to do what they're best at doing, helping these companies with their finances? I used to head CSR at a hedge fund in New York, and what blew my mind is that you had these hedge fund people who would go paint walls in schools. That's really not what they're good at doing. They probably did a terrible job. But with Bank of America, what we tried to change is we tried to get the finance team to help some of these social enterprises with their financials. We got the tech team doing some coding for them and really using the skills that people have, doing what they're best doing, and giving more to the companies. And Bank of America, of course, has a huge network. So that's one way if you have a very good program. So the program we run at IX is called ACTS, but I'm sure there are many others that do the similar thing. It's called Strategic CSR. So you should keep that in mind when you're working with a corporate. Where I see corporates fitting in best is, for instance, with the bond, is do what you're best at doing. We had law firms come in. We didn't ask people to leave their job and join impact investing. We needed 5 law firms actually to work with us on this instrument to make sure it's replicable in other countries in the future. We needed 2 of the largest banks in the region to help us sell to investors. So I see corporates fitting in, doing exactly what they already do, but just with that social mission. It's as opposed to them leaving what they're already good at.
Could I just touch on the way some of these impact funds are developing? And that the majority of them, and the best ones of them, are taking from the French 90-10 system. So France, for nearly 10 years now, has had a scheme called the Fonds Solidaire, that larger companies will offer a savings scheme. And if they offer a savings scheme, they have to offer a solidarity savings scheme, the equivalent of social impact scheme. And those solidarity funds have been modelled on 90% are things that you'd find in the stock market and bond market, but positive screened. 9% direct investment in big things like social housing, school buildings, that kind of thing, and just 1 or 2% in the very high impact sort of areas, probably the majority of social enterprises here. A lot of very small investments into that 1 or 2%. That has brought in 10 billion euros. 1 million people have voluntarily chosen the Fonds Solidaire rather than the normal scheme. And it's escalating and escalating. And that as a model is being adopted. We've seen 6 funds either opened or developed in the UK in this model. There's another half dozen or so in America. We think that that's not, that's not greenwashing or social washing or whatever. That's appropriate, because the only way you're going to be able to take the risk on very small early stage social enterprises is by aggregating them and putting them in a broader spectrum.
Can I just add that actually within our network we have large corporates as well that they're engaging either in 2 ways. So some of them are actually looking at the base of the pyramid actually as a client, and so they're kind of venturing into inclusive business. And really, so having that more, through that, having more of a social impact. But some of them actually have their own either incubation programs or their investment arms that are investing in social enterprises. So, I mean, Singtel is one of the biggest tele companies in Singapore, and they have a really big incubation program right now that is looking at technology, healthcare, and how does so supporting enterprises that are using technology to also be more inclusive, so address the issue of inclusiveness. Yeah.
I don't know who Keone is, but I like you, Keone, because you're asking, I think, what is the big elephant question, and I'm going to put you all on the spot here. So the question is, how do we ensure social impact investment doesn't continue the capitalist pig society and wealth inequality? And I kind of, like, one of the things I feel a lot is is this just some more kind of neoliberalist bullshit? Right? What's really going on here? Are we kind of looking at this machine of capitalism that produces hot dogs, and we're all kind of hoping it now produces lollipops? Right? Like because we have a whole range of this whole generation of entrepreneurs and people trying to use business differently, or use enterprise differently, or tackle really tough social problems, and are we just trying to kind of overlay a sort of Wall Street view of the world onto that? You can blame Keone.
Where do we start? Okay. 2 parts to this. One part is, hang on a minute. The capitalist system has, since the 1970s, led to poverty rates, destitution level poverty going from 40% of the population down to just 10%. It's increased life expectancy by 20 years. A lot of it is in China, absolutely, but a lot of it is also in Africa now and in Southeast Asia. This is something which has saved lives on an awesome scale, absolutely awesome scale. It also leaves in its trail lots of other problems which need to be attacked. For me, social impact investment needs to be both a version of capitalism doing good, and it also needs to be a version of community doing its thing and using finance tools. I love the fact that in the UK we have people saying community share issues are the business and this is what should happen, and other people saying we should have institutional impact funds and that's the solution. I want all of those solutions, and in particular I want there to be ownership of by people who are socially minded into investors that are socially minded, into organisations that are socially minded. And if that involves infiltrating capitalism by having this 30 or 40% of people who want their pension saving into institutions, well, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah,
another example of, so on our equity crowdfunding platform, we've supported about 40 businesses. Now, in the traditional startup ecosystem, does anyone know what are the percentage of successful enterprises, successful startups? It's about 2%. We haven't had any one of our social enterprises fail so far in the 8 years that we're operating. And that's because the community does not allow them to fail because they are giving back to the community. They are structured such that they are market-based solutions, but they are purposed to serve the community. They're purposed to have a triple or double bottom line of profit, people, and planet, so they don't let them fail. And one of the things that at least we look for, and I think most investors do, is when you look at the business of an organization, the impact has to be in the DNA of the business. So for example, we recently raised $2.5 million through our equity crowdfunding platform for a solar company based in India called Maragao Power. Now, the more solar panels they generate, the more profit they have, but also the more CO2 they're reducing and the more rural homes they're giving light to, which can improve productivity. So social, environmental, and profit were actually not mutually exclusive. They're actually working in parallel in the same direction of each other. And that's a strong social enterprise. And that's when it doesn't need to be this mutually exclusive situation in which capital, it has to be either finance or development. Yeah.
Anyone else like to respond? I think that's the big question. And I think we've got to figure that out over time. And I think it's as much on the investors also to make sure that we're staying true to the intent. I think all of you have mentioned that intent, and I think over time that's what's really going to prove whether this thing works.
Yeah, I think with the intent though, one of the critical things is who decides what good is. You know, we're talking about this being impact investment. Who decides that? Is it a government? Is it an institutional investor? Is it me? Is it a social enterprise? Or is it the people who are actually receiving the help? And one of the great things about the impact management program is it's gone right down to the beneficiaries to be asked. I think there are now 700 organizations, 70 of these little huddles working with beneficiaries. What do you think good is? And then working that up the system so that we're not saying impact investment is what I think good is, or what you think good is, or anybody in this room. It's the people on the receiving end of it, and that is hugely important.
And so what have we learned through that process? What can we share with the many in the room representing enterprises? We're talking about investment, we're talking about the impact management, you mentioned it. What are investors' expectations around reporting on impact and measuring impact, and are those expectations realistic? Where are we going with the measurement and management conversation?
I think we need to move beyond negative screening. So that's one thing I've seen a lot of people have adopted. Oh, we don't invest in guns. Right, but what do you invest in? So there are three things that we look at when we do an impact measurement at IIX. One is that we look at the outcomes. So if we're looking at an education company, we don't just count the number of students. We see, did they actually improve their learning outcomes? Are they actually getting better jobs as a result of this? So we look at not just outputs, but outcomes. The second is we have a forward-looking approach. Most NGOs, and I have one myself in India, do impact measurement very retrospectively. At the end of the year, they'll give you a report. What we've seen with our investors is they're very forward-looking. They say, if I give you $1 million, what are you going to do with it over the next 4 years? So we have to take past trends and extrapolate forward-looking impact projections for them. Calculating a social return on investment, which is the third thing we do, is give a financial proxy. Investors, I can tell them everything they need to know about empowering women, how it creates multi-generational impact, how they save better. But if I say the Women's Livelihood Bond will give you $2.5 of social return for every $1, they understand that better. And it's this inherent ability to be able to work with what investors understand and still put in the impact lens is what I think is very, very important. So when we look at impact measurement, those are the three things we try to focus on.
Yeah, and when we look at an impact investment, going through the investment committee process, we actually have a whole process which is looking at not just the financial return, but also the social or environmental return. And right at the beginning, the enterprises need to explain how they're going to be measuring that and how they'll be reporting that. So that's right up front, and we wouldn't go forward if we didn't think both sides were going to be meaningful.
I think it's. I mean, I wanted to highlight that actually. Again, it's so diverse. What different investors want, but it's also from the investors and funders' perspective. It's a whole. Also, I think it's a learning process. And nobody has like a cookie cutter framework where this is the way to measure it. I think it really depends as well as the funders sort of. What they want. Some of them actually they feel like, okay, I've invested in a good organization and I trust that if they're doing well, then obviously they're impactful. I mean, they're doing impact, and I'm good with that. But some of them are doing what Natasha talked about as ROIs. They get it. Tell me about how is it in money terms. But I think I with all the conversation, I wanted to kind of highlight that. It's really important to find the right partner. So think of an investor, and it doesn't have to be impact investment. It's a foundation. Is it the right partner for you, and is it bringing more than just the money? I mean, the financial part is important, but it's just a really small piece of the equation. I think it's really about what else they bring, right? Like, do they share your same mission and your values? Because you don't want an investor that's will push you to, bring like higher returns and kind of, drift away from your mission. And are they bringing like leveraging, when we talk about leveraging other, funders that will later on maybe come because they've come into the game? Are they opening up their network of, lawyers? Because you'll need lawyers, you need marketing people. I mean, so I think it's important to say, is this the right partner for me? And not jump into anything because, okay, here's, I give it to you for 5% or whatever it is.
And Patty, there's a question here from Martin, I think, that relates to, I'd like to extend. Much of what we talked about, is kind of on quite a larger scale than many enterprises are ever going to engage with, right? So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars and large foundations and wholesale investors. For many of the enterprises here, that's something that's just beyond what they're ever looking to want to engage with from an investment perspective. How do we translate that into
I mean, from our point of view, both as an impact investor and as a grant investor in social enterprises, we have funded 100,000 or 250,000. Not everything is up in the millions. So, I mean, it has to be matched with the actual enterprise. So I think, there's all scale, really. Yeah.
And Cliff, have you seen, I mean, you invest in funds and other investors that then do the investment. What are you seeing? What have you learned through that process?
I mean, we've deliberately gone very diverse. So we've invested in funds which, have an average of sort of 30,000 UK
pounds.
So what's that in? Yep. Almost double it in New Zealand dollars, roughly speaking. And all the way through to ones which are doing major social property developments. So they're in the sort of 100 million level. And that's deliberate because people at different stages, different sizes of organisation need very different kinds of finance. So deliberately diversifying right across the waterfront.
That diversity needs an ecosystem. And there's been quite a few questions here relating to the role government can play. There was a question from Sally and there was a question from somewhere else. Obviously, government played a large role in what you're doing. Patty, you do a bit of work with government around policy as well. I'm just interested, where can government play an effective role in helping that ecosystem to develop and that diversity to come through?
So we just did this big report with the United Nations on the role of governments in driving forward the SDGs. And there are three things that we found. So one is, like I said, the other side of innovation is risk. One of the biggest things that the government can do is come in and de-risk some of these securities. So for instance, with our bond, having the US government say that they'll give a 50% guarantee was very powerful. and have the Australian government saying they'll subsidize this was even more powerful because you have two different people from across the world saying that they will de-risk a security. It gives investors an incredible amount of comfort. The second thing that we've found is that just being a catalytic policymaker is very, very powerful as well. So for instance, in India, the new CSR law, which says 2% of company profits have to go towards social purpose work, is also very powerful because it's more of a negative incentive, but it still works in some circumstances. And in the UK, there's positive incentives. So there's the social investment tax relief, in which you say if you invest in a social purpose organization, you get tax relief the same way a 501c3 in the United States would get a tax rebate. So there are many different ways that we've seen this work very effectively in action. Those are just 3 examples.
You go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, I mean, one of our initiatives within AVPN is around the Asia Policy Forum. So we do see that it is really important to, if we want to, we talked about scale, right? So philanthropy foundations can do the pilots and de-risk and then get private investors in it. But if we really want to reach the scale, then, the role of the government is very essential. So, I mean, I think I saw some of the members from South Korea, but in South Korea there's a proper social enterprise law, and from there you can see the kind of influence that has created in terms of creating the ecosystem of various diverse social enterprises. So there's in Singapore, for example, there is no such law because they don't want to create a clear framework, but. And then I would argue that perhaps that is also part of it why we don't see so many social enterprises. But then again, we could say that it's the market, it's very small. So yeah, definitely a big role to play.
Governments and social enterprises aren't necessarily aligned interests. There are times, certainly in my country, where we really don't like what the government is doing. We do not want that kind of investment, thank you very much, and social enterprises would not touch it. So to me, the most useful thing a government can do is the enabling. It's the permissions, the regulations, the tax breaks, all that kind of thing. There are countries, South Korea being one, Scotland within the UK being another, where government is the overwhelming financier as well. Personally, I worry about that. I worry about it for 2 reasons. One is that there can be a change of politics and then suddenly it goes. So it's not diversified enough to be stable, but also just, governments have their own imperatives and they're not necessarily the imperatives of the poor. So I think this stuff matters. Ownership matters. Institutions matter. Who owns the institutions matters. I have to think back that in the early days of stock exchanges were to democratize the ownership of capital. That is not the case now. So here we are with impact investment, thinking that this is democratizing the achievement of social benefit. We have to be very careful. We have to build institutions that hold it for the poor, for the disadvantaged, rather than for governments or for the very wealthy.
Which is probably a good last question. The power dynamic between investors and entrepreneurs and enterprises, and where do you all feel that that's at, and is it healthy? That comments on the power dynamic.
From our point of view, with our affordable housing loan fund with CEFA, that actually was something we developed with CEFA. So that was a co-designed impact investment, and then Habitat for Humanity came forward to seek approval for the loan. But other organisations can also apply. So from that point of view, that was a very the power dynamic was really quite good, and that's a very open kind of relationship between all 3 parties, really.
I think that the unknown secret is that in most developed countries, there is more impact finance than organisations that can take it. What that means is, folks out there, if your business plan is good enough that you can take and repay investment, you've got your first foot forward. the investors really want you. They won't necessarily let you know that's the case, of course. So you should shop around and get your best deal. I think it's different in developing countries, but in most developed countries there is more impact capital than there is organisations to absorb it.
Great. So I'm just conscious of time. I think we've got a break now at 3 o'clock. I just thought I'd share some thoughts, and then because I've got the stage and I can, and then I'd like to thank you all for participating in the conversation, and we've got a couple of gifts for you. I really loved how you talked, Cliff, around the fact that impact investment is not necessarily going to be right for everybody, and actually it's probably a much smaller. I didn't know those stats, so I'm surprised that most what was it, 3% or whatever that you said of companies actually take on external investment. I think there's almost an expectation at times that enterprises and entrepreneurs should be looking for investors, when in fact that's not how it's actually playing out or working in mainstream, let alone in the social enterprise world. So I really enjoyed hearing that. Of the portion of enterprises that will end up seeking external investment, that's kind of going to suck if we're still at a 1, 2 or 3 based on the poll. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do, and I think tackling, engaging in a way that has a more equalised power dynamic is part of that, and it's also, I think, about getting both the investors and the investees much more aligned around what we both want to achieve. The only other thing I would kind of share as a thought provoker to the audience is the biggest worry I also have, and some of you already shared this concern, is that this whole impact washing kind of risk, right? That we have all of these capitalist pig institutions coming in and doing kind of just whacking impact as a label on stuff that isn't really very impactful, and really just using it as a way to kind of greenwash or impact wash what they're doing. I think we all get that as a risk. I think we all are aware of that, and we're all concerned about that, right? However, I would also say that there are groups of investors, and I don't know everybody here. I know Catherine better than I know the three of you, but the limited time I've spent with all four of you, and with many investors that I have spent time with, there are investors out there that care just as much about these issues as you do as entrepreneurs. So not all investors are sitting there as capitalist pigs looking at this as just an exercise of how to make money, right? There are plenty of investors who, in many cases, are entrepreneurs themselves, and have got into this because this is the way that they can apply their skills, their networks, their experience to do something that they feel passionate about. And so when you're thinking about investors or are unhappy with investors, there isn't just one type of investor. And there are many in this space who care just as much about these issues as everybody else in this room. And my encouragement to you would be, go and find them, right? Because if it's still at a 1, 2 or 3, maybe it's because you're not talking to the people that could make it a 5. So I will leave it there, and I think 3 o'clock we're going to have a break. If you could all join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Thank you. And we have a gift for all of you. Thanks, guys.